the Roman Catholic Church took over 1,000 years to build its authority over England. Henry VIII dismantled it in less than 3. What Rome had spent centuries constructing through crusades, cathedrals, and canon law, one impatient Tudor king unraveled with a signature, a scaffold, and a supreme act of self-appointed authority. But the Church of England that rose from that wreckage proved to be something neither its founder nor its enemies expected, a church stubborn enough to survive being pulled apart by every generation that inherited it, and flexible enough to remake itself each time. It has outlasted the monarchy that created it, the empire that exported it, and every prediction of its decline. How does a church born from such a cynical and chaotic beginning endure for 500 years and spread to every continent on earth? Join us as we uncover the entire history of the Church of England, from Henry's break with Rome to the global institution it is today. Long before a Tudor king would shatter the bond between England and Rome, long before the thunderous proclamations of Parliament and the quiet scratch of a royal pen, Christianity was already ancient on this island. Its roots ran deeper than any dynasty, deeper than any political ambition, stretching back nearly 1,500 years before Henry VIII drew his first breath. The story begins with the Romans. When the legions of Emperor Claudius arrived in 43 AD, they brought with them the machinery of empire and eventually its evolving faith. By the 3rd century, Christian communities had quietly taken hold in Roman Britain. Saints like Alban, a Roman soldier who sheltered a Christian priest and paid for that compassion with his life around 209 AD, became the first recorded British martyr. His name still graces a cathedral city north of London today. But Rome's grip on Britain loosened, and when the legions withdrew in the early 5th century, waves of pagan Anglo-Saxon settlers pushed Christianity to the fringes, to the mountains of Wales and the windswept monasteries of Ireland. For nearly 2 centuries, the faith flickered rather than blazed on English soil. Then came Augustine. In 597 AD, Pope Gregory I dispatched a monk named Augustine and roughly 40 companions on a mission to the pagan kingdom of Kent. It was, by any measure, a nervous undertaking. Augustine reportedly asked Gregory if they could simply turn back. Gregory said no. And so Augustine landed on the Isle of Thanet, was received by King Ethelbert of Kent, and began the work of conversion that would reshape a civilization. By Christmas of that same year, thousands of Kentish men and women had accepted baptism. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that endures to this day. Yet Christianity in Britain was not a single unified voice. The Celtic Church, shaped by centuries of isolation in Ireland and Northumbria, observed different customs from Rome, including a different calculation for Easter and a distinct style of monastic tonsure. These differences were more than symbolic. They were questions of authority and identity. The matter came to a head in 664 AD at the Synod of Whitby, convened in a Northumbrian monastery overlooking the North Sea. King Oswy of Northumbria presided over the debate. When the Roman argument prevailed, the English Church formally aligned itself with Rome and with the wider Christian world. It was a defining moment. England was not merely adopting a calendar. It was choosing a civilizational direction. Over the following centuries, Anglo-Saxon monasteries became engines of learning, art, and literacy. Figures like the Venerable Bede wrote histories that still inform our understanding of early medieval life. The church and the crown grew entwined, each lending the other legitimacy. It was a relationship that would, in time, become complicated beyond imagining. By the year 1000, the English Church stood at the center of daily life in a way modern observers might struggle to imagine. Cathedrals rose above market towns like stone sermons. Parish priests recorded births, blessed harvests, and guided souls from cradle to grave. The Church owned perhaps a third of all English land, and its calendar governed the rhythm of every working year. But even then, questions simmered beneath the surface. Who truly held authority over the English Church? The Pope in Rome or the King in Westminster? The answer, for centuries, was contested. The bitter dispute between Henry II and Archbishop Thomas Becket, ending in Becket's murder inside Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, revealed just how violently that tension could erupt. Becket became a martyr almost immediately, his shrine a destination for pilgrims from across Europe. Yet, the underlying question of authority remained unresolved. Into this world of uneasy compromise stepped John Wycliffe. A scholar and theologian based at Oxford, Wycliffe spent the 1370s and 1380s dismantling the foundations of papal authority with the precision of a man who knew exactly how dangerous his words were. He argued that the Church had grown corrupt, bloated with wealth it had no right to hold. He questioned whether the Pope held any divine authority at all. Most radically, he believed that Scripture, not church tradition, was the supreme guide for Christian life. And if Scripture was supreme, then ordinary people needed to be able to read it. Working with associates and followers, Wycliffe oversaw the translation of the Bible into English in the 1380s, the first complete rendering of the text that common men and women could, in theory, hold in their own hands. It was a revolutionary act dressed in scholarly robes. His followers, dismissed as lollards, a word probably derived from a Dutch term meaning mumbler, carried these ideas into the streets and fields of England. They rejected the priesthood's exclusive power, questioned the doctrine of transubstantiation, and insisted that faith was a matter between a believer and God, not a transaction managed by clergy. The Church responded with fear, and then with fire. The Statute de Heretico Cumburendo, passed in 1401, authorized the burning of heretics. Lollard leaders were hunted, tried, and executed. The movement was driven underground but never fully extinguished. Alongside this theological unease ran a more practical resentment. English kings and their subjects increasingly chafed at the river of gold flowing southward to Rome in the form of papal taxes and fees. Why should English wealth fill Italian coffers? Anti-clerical feeling was not the property of radical reformers alone. It lived in the hearts of merchants, lawyers, and minor nobles who watched church courts claim jurisdiction over matters that felt increasingly like affairs of the English state. Then in 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg and set Europe ablaze. Luther's challenge to Rome spread with the speed that only the newly invented printing press could provide. His arguments resonated in England precisely because the ground had already been prepared. Wycliffe, a century earlier, had asked the same questions. The Lollards had suffered for them. When a restless, ambitious young king named Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, he inherited a realm where loyalty to Rome was broad but no longer unquestioned, where reformist ideas moved quietly through university halls and merchant households alike. The fire had not yet caught, but the kindling had been laid for generations. By the early 1520s, Henry VIII appeared to be everything England could want in a king. He was tall, athletic, and educated, a man who composed music and debated theology with equal confidence. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the dignified Spanish princess he had wed in 1509, seemed to anchor the dynasty. But behind the pageantry of the Tudor court, a crisis was quietly taking shape. Catherine had been pregnant 6 times. Only one child survived, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. For Henry, this was not merely a personal disappointment. It was a dynastic catastrophe. The Wars of the Roses, which had torn England apart within living memory, had been fought over exactly this kind of succession uncertainty. Without a legitimate male heir, everything his father had built felt fragile. The question consumed him. Then, sometime around 1525, Henry's attention fixed itself on a young woman at court. Anne Boleyn was sharp, fashionable, and unlike the other women who had briefly caught the king's eye, she refused to become his mistress. If Henry wanted her, she made clear, he would have to make her his queen. What began as infatuation hardened into obsession. Henry convinced himself, with the help of selective scripture reading, that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the eyes of God. Catherine had previously been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, who died young. Henry now argued that marrying a brother's widow violated divine law, and that the Pope who had granted the original dispensation had exceeded his authority. The marriage was not merely unhappy, Henry insisted. It was no marriage at all. This was the matter that would reshape England. Henry turned to his most powerful minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a man of extraordinary ability who had made himself indispensable to the crown. Wolsey's task was to secure an annulment from Rome through his considerable influence with Pope Clement VII. In normal circumstances, such arrangements were not unheard of. Popes had accommodated powerful monarchs before. But the circumstances were not normal. In May of 1527, troops loyal to Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had sacked Rome in a campaign of appalling violence. Clement, effectively a prisoner of the emperor's political orbit, found himself paralyzed. And Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. He would not permit his aunt to be cast aside and humiliated at England's convenience. Wolsey tried every legal instrument available to him. In 1529, a Legantine court convened at Blackfriars in London to examine the case directly. Catherine appeared before it and made an appeal of devastating dignity, addressing Henry personally and reminding him and the assembled court that she had been a faithful wife in every particular. The proceedings collapsed without resolution. Clement recalled the case to Rome. Henry's patience was exhausted. Wolsey, who had failed the one task that mattered, fell from power in the autumn of 1529, stripped of his offices and charged with praemunire, the offense of asserting foreign jurisdiction in England. He died the following year before he could be tried for treason, fortunate perhaps in the timing. For the next 3 years, Henry and his advisors explored a different approach entirely. What if papal authority over England was itself the problem? A new generation of counselors, including the nimble lawyer Thomas Cromwell and the reformist cleric Thomas Cranmer, began constructing the legal and theological architecture for something that would have seemed unthinkable just a decade before. Pope Clement issued his final refusal to grant the annulment in 1533, the same year Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. By then, the ground had already shifted beneath the Church of England's feet. The question was no longer whether Henry would break with Rome. It was how completely and how quickly that break would be made. The machinery of separation was already turning, and no papal decree could stop it now. The man who turned Henry's fury into legislation was not a churchman or a nobleman. Thomas Cromwell was the son of a blacksmith from Putney, a lawyer of ruthless practical intelligence who had once served Wolsey and survived his master's fall by making himself useful to the king. Where others saw a theological crisis, Cromwell saw a constitutional opportunity. His strategy was methodical and relentless. Beginning in 1532, Parliament became the instrument of revolution. A series of carefully drafted statutes began dismantling the legal foundations of papal authority in England, piece by piece. The submission of the clergy, passed in May of 1532, forced the English Church to surrender its independent lawmaking powers to the crown. Bishops and priests who had once answered ultimately to Rome would now answer to Henry. It was not yet the final break, but it was the door swinging open. Into this charged moment stepped Thomas Cranmer. A Cambridge theologian of reformist sympathies, Cranmer had argued, crucially, that the question of Henry's marriage should be settled by scripture and by university opinion rather than papal decree. Henry recognized in Cranmer exactly the kind of churchman he needed. When the Archbishopric of Canterbury fell vacant in 1533, Cranmer was appointed to fill it. The appointment was confirmed by Rome, which had not yet grasped the full implications of what was coming. Cranmer moved swiftly. In May of 1533, he convened an ecclesiastical court at Dunstable and, in Catherine's absence, declared her marriage to Henry null and void. Days later, he pronounced Henry's secret union with Anne Boleyn valid. Anne was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of June, 1533. She was already pregnant. The child, born that September, was a daughter named Elizabeth. Then came the Act of Supremacy. Passed by Parliament in November of 1534, it was a document of extraordinary audacity. Its language was almost casual in the weight it carried, declaring that the King's Majesty justly and rightfully was the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Not the Pope. Not a council of bishops. Henry alone. The break with Rome, a millennium of institutional authority, was accomplished in a few lines of parliamentary text. Cromwell enforced the new order with characteristic efficiency. An oath acknowledging the Act of Supremacy and the legitimacy of Henry's marriage was required from all royal subjects. For most, compliance came without great anguish. For two men, it was impossible. Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor and the most celebrated humanist scholar in England, had resigned his office quietly rather than endorse the proceedings. He had hoped silence might protect him. It did not. Bishop John Fisher of Rochester, aged and frail, was equally uncompromising. Both men refused the oath on grounds of conscience. Both were arrested and confined to the Tower of London. Fisher was executed on the 22nd of June, 1535. More followed him to the scaffold on Tower Hill on the 6th of July. More's reported final words, that he died the king's good servant but God's first, echoed across Catholic Europe and would be remembered long after the political calculations of that summer were forgotten. Their deaths sent an unmistakable signal. The new order would tolerate no divided loyalties. The executions horrified much of the continent. Pope Paul III, who had succeeded Clement, excommunicated Henry formally. Francis I of France and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire expressed outrage. But outrage, without an army behind it, was just noise, and Henry knew it. Within 3 years, England had moved from a kingdom that chafed under papal inconvenience to one that had legally abolished papal authority entirely, executed its most respected Catholic figures, and placed a layman at the head of its church. The transformation was staggering in its speed. Yet for all the legal machinery that had been set in motion, a deeper question remained unanswered. What, precisely, did the Church of England now believe? The institutions had changed. The theology had not, at least not yet. That argument, far more turbulent than any act of Parliament, was still to come. The ink was barely dry on the Act of Supremacy when Thomas Cromwell turned his attention to an extraordinary prize. The monasteries of England, Wales, and Ireland represented centuries of accumulated wealth, land, and influence. Hundreds of religious houses dotted the landscape, from great abbeys like Fountains and Glastonbury to small rural priories with only a handful of monks. Together, they controlled perhaps 1/4 of all the cultivated land in England. Cromwell intended to know exactly what they were worth. In 1535, he dispatched teams of royal commissioners across the country to conduct a comprehensive survey. The resulting document, known as the Valor Ecclesiasticus, was a remarkable feat of bureaucratic ambition. It cataloged the income, properties, and conduct of nearly 900 religious houses with forensic precision. Cromwell's commissioners were not neutral observers. They arrived with instructions to record evidence of corruption, laxity, and moral failure alongside the financial inventories. They found what they were looking for, or manufactured enough of it to serve the purpose. The suppression began with the smaller houses. In 1536, Parliament passed the Act of Suppression, targeting monasteries with annual incomes below £200. Around 376 establishments were closed in this first wave. Their valuables were seized, their monks and nuns pensioned off or transferred to larger houses, and their buildings stripped of anything useful. The message was clear, though the Crown insisted the larger, better-governed houses would be spared. That promise would not survive long. The north of England erupted in fury. In October of 1536, a massive popular uprising began in Lincolnshire and spread rapidly into Yorkshire and beyond. The rebels called their movement the Pilgrimage of Grace, framing their resistance as a holy cause. Under the banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ, they marched in their tens of thousands, led by a Yorkshire lawyer named Robert Askey. Their grievances were real and deep. The dissolution of local monasteries had struck at the heart of northern communities, where abbeys had served as hospitals, schools, and centers of economic life for generations. Henry responded with cunning rather than immediate force. He negotiated, offered pardons, and made vague promises of reform. The pilgrims dispersed. When a smaller subsequent rising broke out in early 1537, Henry had his pretext. The pardons were revoked. Askell was executed. Nearly 200 rebels were hanged across the northern counties as a warning against further resistance. The Pilgrimage of Grace had failed, but it revealed how deeply the dissolution had fractured English society. It did not slow Cromwell. By 1539, Parliament passed the Act for the dissolution of the greater monasteries. The remaining houses fell one by one. Some surrendered voluntarily under pressure, others under direct coercion. Glastonbury Abbey, among the oldest and most venerable religious sites in England, was dissolved in November of 1539. Its last abbot, Richard Whiting, was hanged on Glastonbury Tor and his body quartered and displayed as a trophy. By 1540, the process was essentially complete. More than 800 religious houses had been dissolved in under 5 years. The human cost was immense. Thousands of monks, nuns, and friars were scattered. Some received modest pensions. Many did not. The land itself tells the final story. Millions of acres passed from the church into the hands of the crown, and from the crown into the hands of a new class of landowners. Nobles and gentry who purchased or received monastic properties became, almost overnight, deeply invested in the permanence of the Reformation. They would never willingly return those lands to Rome. It was a transformation with consequences that would outlast Henry himself. The question now was what kind of church would fill the spiritual space left behind? What kind of church had Henry actually built? He had broken with Rome, seized its properties, and declared himself supreme head, yet he remained, at heart, a man of profoundly traditional faith. The contradiction would define the final decade of his reign, as the Church of England lurched uncertainly between the old world and the new. In 1536, the same year the monasteries began to fall, Henry's theologians produced the 10 Articles. These were the first formal statement of doctrine for the new church, and they revealed just how ambiguous its foundations truly were. The Articles reduced the Catholic sacraments from 7 to 3, a gesture toward reformist thinking, yet retained prayers for the dead and veneration of saints. They satisfied no one completely. Reformers saw promise. Traditionalists saw heresy creeping in through the back door. Anne Boleyn would not survive to see where it led. The queen for whom Henry had shattered the English church was arrested in April of 1536 on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was thin and almost certainly fabricated, but Henry needed a way out. On the 19th of May, Anne was beheaded on Tower Green. She was perhaps 35 years old. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. The theological pendulum swung sharply in 1539. With the 6 Articles, Parliament reasserted traditional Catholic doctrine in uncompromising terms. Transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, private masses, all were affirmed. Those who denied them faced death. Reformers called it the whip with 6 strings. Archbishop Cranmer, quietly sympathetic to Protestant ideas, had married a German woman during his time abroad. He sent her back to the continent in a trunk to protect them both. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of so much of Henry's revolution, had overreached. His arrangement of Henry's 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves in January of 1540 proved disastrous. Henry found his new bride physically repulsive and blamed Cromwell for the humiliation. His enemies at court, particularly the conservative Howard faction, seized the moment. Cromwell was arrested in June of 1540 on charges of treason and heresy. The man who had dismantled 800 monasteries and transformed English governance was executed on Tower Hill on the 28th of July, 1540. Henry married his 5th wife, the young Catherine Howard, the very same day. Catherine Howard was executed in February of 1542, convicted of adultery. Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, was a woman of genuine Protestant sympathies who proved wise enough to survive him. By his final years, Henry was a wreck of the magnificent king he had once been. His leg ulcers caused him constant agony. He was enormously fat, barely able to walk. Yet he continued to shape his church, blocking further reform while never fully embracing Rome again. He died on the 28th of January, 1547, at the Palace of Whitehall. He was 55 years old. He left behind a church that was neither fully Catholic nor properly Protestant. It had severed its connection to Rome, but kept much of the old liturgy and doctrine. It had new masters and new landowners, but ancient rituals. It was, in many ways, Henry's own image, grand, contradictory, and deeply resistant to being told what to do. The question of what the Church of England would truly become had not been answered. It had simply been deferred, waiting for whoever would sit next upon the throne. And waiting in the wings was a 9-year-old boy with advisors of fierce Protestant conviction, ready to push the church in directions his father had never sanctioned. Henry VIII was barely cold in his grave before the reformers moved. Edward VI was 9 years old when he inherited the throne in January of 1547. A pale, serious, intellectually gifted boy, he had been raised on Protestant ideas by carefully chosen tutors. He could not rule alone, and so the kingdom passed into the hands of a regency council dominated by his uncle, Edward Seymour, who swiftly claimed the title Lord Protector. Seymour and his allies were men of Protestant conviction, and they recognized the extraordinary opportunity before them. The brake that Henry had applied to religious reform was gone. The road ahead was open. Thomas Cranmer had waited a very long time for this moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury had harbored reformist sympathies for years, suppressed by a king who found radical theology distasteful. Now, freed from that constraint, Cranmer moved with quiet, methodical purpose. He was a scholar and a liturgist, and his great ambition was to give the English people worship in their own language, dignified, ordered, and rooted in Scripture rather than in the accumulated traditions of medieval Catholicism. In 1548, across England, the first visible changes arrived. Altars were stripped of their candles, images, and relics. Statues were pulled from niches and smashed. Stained glass was broken. Rood screens came down. Churches that had blazed with color and gilded decoration were whitewashed into austerity. For many ordinary people, this was genuinely shocking. These were not abstractions of theology. These were the images before which their grandparents had knelt and prayed. But Cranmer's most revolutionary contribution was not the hammer. It was the pen. In 1549, the first Book of Common Prayer came into force, enforced by an Act of Uniformity passed by Parliament. For the first time in English history, every church in the land would use the same order of service, conducted entirely in English. Cranmer's prose was luminous, stately, and deeply careful. He wrote liturgy that Protestants could accept and that Catholics could, with some effort, still recognize. The communion service replaced the Latin Mass, but it was deliberately ambiguous on the question of what exactly happened to the bread and wine. Cranmer was buying time, and perhaps building consensus. It was not enough for the more ardent reformers, nor for the people of Cornwall and Devon, who rose in rebellion against the new prayer book, demanding the return of the Latin Mass. They called the English liturgy a Christmas game. The rebellion was crushed with considerable bloodshed. By 1552, the pace of change had accelerated further. A second Book of Common Prayer appeared, dramatically more Protestant in character. The ambiguity of the first book was stripped away. The communion table replaced the altar entirely. The words of distribution were rewritten to remove any suggestion of Christ's physical presence in the bread and wine. And in 1553, Cranmer completed his 42 Articles of Religion, a formal doctrinal statement firmly grounding the Church of England in Protestant theology. England had traveled an extraordinary distance in just 6 years. The church Henry had left behind, uncertain and contradictory, had been transformed into something recognizably Protestant in doctrine and in worship. But the boy king who had presided over this transformation was dying. Edward VI had contracted tuberculosis, and by the summer of 1553, it was clear he would not survive. He was 15 years old. Everything that Cranmer and the reformers had built now depended on who came next. And coming next was a woman shaped by very different convictions, who had watched the dismantling of the faith she loved with grief and fury. She had waited for this moment through decades of humiliation. Mary Tudor was 37 years old when she rode into London in August of 1553, greeted by crowds whose enthusiasm surprised even her supporters. The people had watched Edward's counselors attempt a desperate maneuver, placing the young Lady Jane Grey on the throne to preserve the Protestant succession. Jane was 16, brilliant, and utterly unprepared for what was asked of her. She held the crown for 9 days before Mary's forces swept the coup aside. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower. Within months, she was executed, a casualty of other people's ambitions rather than her own. Mary's legitimacy was beyond serious challenge. Her popularity, at first, was genuine. But she came to the throne with a mission she considered sacred, to undo everything that had been done to the faith of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and to return England to Rome. The speed of the reversal was breathtaking. Within months of Mary's accession, the Protestant bishops were removed from their sees. Thomas Cranmer was arrested and charged with heresy. The Latin Mass returned to English churches. In November of 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived as papal legate, and Parliament formally submitted to the authority of Rome for the first time since 1534. 20 years of schism were, on paper, undone in a single session. Mary also married Philip II of Spain, a union that many English people viewed with deep suspicion. A Catholic queen binding England to the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe seemed to threaten English independence itself. The marriage was politically disastrous, even if Mary believed it served God's purposes. Then came the burnings. Beginning in February of 1555, Protestant men and women were condemned as heretics and burned at the stake across England. The executions took place in towns and villages, publicly, so that crowds might witness the wages of error. Nearly 300 people died in this way over the following 3 years. Among them were bishops, scholars, and ordinary working people. Among them, most famously, was Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer's end was prolonged and agonizing in ways that went beyond the physical. Under pressure, the aging archbishop signed a series of recantations renouncing the Protestant faith he had built. Mary intended to burn him anyway. When Cranmer realized this, something steadied in him. At the stake in Oxford in March of 1556, he thrust his right hand, the hand that had signed the recantations, into the flames first, declaring it should be punished for what it had done. He died holding it there. His death, and the deaths of hundreds of others, did not achieve what Mary intended. They created martyrs. John Foxe, an English Protestant exile on the continent, was already collecting testimonies and accounts of the persecutions. His book, eventually published as Acts and Monuments but known to history as the Book of Martyrs, would become one of the most widely read texts in the English language. With vivid, unflinching detail, it enshrined the Marian victims as heroes of the true faith and Mary herself as a monster. For generations of English Protestants, the Book of Martyrs was second only to the Bible in religious authority. The name Bloody Mary entered the language and never left it. Mary died in November of 1558, possibly of uterine or ovarian cancer, her Spanish marriage childless, her restoration unraveling. Cardinal Pole died the same day. 5 years of Catholic rule had failed to extinguish English Protestantism. If anything, the flames of Smithfield had burned it deeper into the national consciousness than any reformer could have managed alone. The question of what came next now fell to a 25-year-old woman waiting at Hatfield House, watching the autumn leaves fall. She had been waiting at Hatfield when the messengers arrived. Elizabeth Tudor was 25 years old, daughter of Anne Boleyn, survivor of a court that had tried to destroy her more than once. She had watched her brother impose Protestant reform. She had survived her sister's Catholic restoration. She had learned, through long and dangerous years, the supreme virtue of patience. Now England was hers, and it was a nation exhausted by whiplash. What did Elizabeth herself believe? Historians have debated the question for centuries. She kept her own counsel with extraordinary discipline. What is clear is that she understood, with cold political intelligence, what her country needed. Not another revolution. Not a new crusade. Something rarer and more difficult. A settlement that most people could live with. The machinery of that settlement moved quickly. Parliament met in the spring of 1559, and 2 pieces of legislation reshaped the English Church with permanent consequence. The Act of Supremacy restored the break with Rome, but with a deliberate change of language. Henry VIII had styled himself the supreme head of the Church of England, a title that had alarmed even some Protestants by its near-blasphemous ring. Elizabeth took a more careful title, Supreme Governor. The distinction mattered. She was not claiming spiritual authority over souls, only the crown's governance of the institutional church. It was a subtle but meaningful concession, designed to make the settlement palatable to moderate Catholics as well as Protestants. The Act of Uniformity restored Protestant worship and imposed a revised Book of Common Prayer. Cranmer's great literary achievement returned to English altars, though in a revised form that softened some of its harder Protestant edges. The crucial test was the words spoken at communion. Where earlier versions had made pointed statements about the nature of the bread and wine, the new formula combined both the Protestant and the more traditional Catholic phrasings into a single sentence. A worshiper could hear what they wished to hear. This was not accident. This was policy. It was the via media, the middle way. The settlement asked its subjects to conform outwardly while leaving the deeper questions of conscience in deliberate ambiguity. Catholic ceremonies survived in modified forms. Clergy wore vestments. Churches retained much of their traditional visual character. Yet the Pope's authority was gone. Scripture stood supreme, and the Mass in its Roman form was abolished. The settlement was Protestant in its bones, but dressed in older garments. Not everyone was satisfied. Committed Protestants, many of whom had spent Mary's reign in exile in Geneva and Zurich, returned to England hungry for a more thoroughgoing reformation. They found the settlement frustratingly incomplete. They would soon earn a name that stuck like a rebuke: Puritans. On the other side, Catholics who could not reconcile themselves to the break with Rome faced increasingly severe penalties as the decades passed. But those tensions lay ahead. In 1563, Convocation adopted the 39 Articles, a document that gave the Elizabethan Church its formal doctrinal foundation. The Articles addressed the contested questions of the age: Scripture, salvation, the sacraments, the nature of the Church, with a Calvinist leaning on questions of grace, but deliberate imprecision on others. They were designed to include as many as possible while excluding only the most extreme positions on either wing. The 39 Articles remain the confessional standard of the Church of England to this day. Every ordained minister still formally assents to them. They are a document written in the grammar of compromise, which is perhaps why they have lasted so long. Elizabeth had inherited a church that had changed masters 4 times in 25 years. She gave it something it had never quite had before: stability. The Elizabethan Settlement was not a perfect theology. It was a political and spiritual architecture sturdy enough to shelter a nation. But architecture, however clever, must withstand storms. And the storms were already gathering from Rome, from Protestant Europe, and from within England itself, where a generation of returning exiles had encountered a far more radical Reformation and found they could not forget it. The storms did not take long to arrive. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued a document that changed everything. The papal bull Regnans in Excelsis declared Elizabeth a heretic, excommunicated her from the Catholic Church, and did something no pope had done to an English monarch in decades. It released her Catholic subjects from their allegiance to her. It did not simply condemn the Queen. It invited her overthrow. The practical effect was brutal, and not in the way Rome intended. Before the bull, many English Catholics had managed an uneasy compromise, attending Protestant services while keeping their faith privately. After it, every Catholic became a potential traitor in the eyes of the state. The papacy had drawn a line that forced people to choose between their church and their crown. Many chose their crown, but others chose differently, and those who did would spend the next 3 decades feeding a cycle of plot and repression that darkened Elizabeth's reign. The conspiracies came in succession, each more dangerous than the last. The Rodolphi plot of 1571 sought to depose Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic claimant whose very existence gave every conspiracy a focal point and a candidate. The Throckmorton plot of 1583 revealed a coordinated plan involving Spain, the papacy, and French Catholic forces. The Babington plot of 1586 was the most explicit of all. Letters fatally implicated Mary herself. What was to be done with a queen who was also a captive, a symbol, and a magnet for assassination plots? Elizabeth resisted the answer for as long as she could. She signed the death warrant with evident anguish. On the 8th of February 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. The Catholic cause had lost its English face. It had not lost its Spanish arm. Philip II of Spain, Catholic champion of Europe, had been building toward confrontation for years. In the summer of 1588, he sent it. The Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying thousands of soldiers, sailed north toward England. What followed became one of the most celebrated episodes in English history. Storms, English fireships, and the tactical skill of commanders like Francis Drake and Lord Howard scattered and destroyed the fleet. Fewer than half the ships returned to Spain. The defeat carried enormous symbolic weight for the Church of England. Protestant preachers proclaimed it an act of divine providence, God's own verdict on the competing claims of Rome and Canterbury. The medal struck to commemorate the victory bore a telling inscription. God blew, and they were scattered. The Armada's failure fused English national identity with Protestant faith in ways that would prove extraordinarily durable. Yet, while the Catholic threat dominated foreign policy, an internal challenge grew louder. The Puritans, those returning exiles who had never forgiven the settlement its compromises, pushed persistently for further reform. The vestments controversy of the 1560s had already forced Archbishop Parker to discipline clergy who refused to wear traditional church garments. The argument ran deeper than clothing. It was an argument about whether the Church of England had truly broken with Rome's corruptions or merely redecorated them. Elizabeth herself had little patience for Puritan demands. She had constructed the settlement deliberately. She had no intention of dismantling it. As the Queen entered the final years of her reign, the church she had shaped stood tested but intact, defined by its enemies as much as its architects. The Catholic threat had been defeated. The Puritan challenge had been contained for now. But contained pressures do not disappear. They accumulate. And when Elizabeth died in 1603, the question of what the Church of England truly was remained, stubbornly and dangerously, unresolved. When Elizabeth died without an heir in 1603, the crown passed north. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting two kingdoms under one Protestant king. He arrived in London carrying expectations from every direction. The Puritans saw a king raised in the Calvinist tradition of the Scottish Kirk and hoped, at last, for a monarch who would push the English Church toward genuine reform. They were about to be disappointed. Within months of his accession, James convened the Hampton Court Conference of 1604, a formal debate between church bishops and Puritan representatives. The Puritans presented their millenary petition, so named because it claimed roughly 1,000 clerical signatures, calling for changes to worship, ceremony, and church governance. James listened. He engaged. Then he drew his line. When the word presbytery was raised, suggesting a church governed by elected elders rather than bishops, the king's patience collapsed entirely. No bishop, he declared, meant no king. Episcopal hierarchy and royal authority were, in his mind, inseparable. The Puritans left Hampton Court with almost nothing they had asked for. But the conference produced something neither side had specifically demanded, and something the world would never forget. James authorized a new English translation of the Bible, one that would replace the competing versions cluttering the nation's pulpits. 47 scholars, working across 6 committees in Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster, spent 7 years on the task. In 1611, the King James Bible was published. The timing could not have been more fortunate or more providential depending on one's perspective. The English language was at a peak of literary richness, the age of Shakespeare and Marlowe still fresh in the air. The translators drew on earlier versions, particularly William Tyndale's pioneering work from nearly a century before, while refining the language into something of extraordinary cadence and clarity. Phrases born in those pages, the salt of the earth, a drop in the bucket, how are the mighty fallen, passed so completely into common speech that millions today use them without knowing their origin. No single English text has exerted comparable influence on the language itself. The year 1605 brought a very different kind of event. A group of Catholic conspirators, frustrated by James's failure to grant toleration, packed barrels of gunpowder beneath the Houses of Parliament and planned to detonate them on the 5th of November, the day the king would open the new session. The plot was discovered the night before. Guy Fawkes was found in the cellars and arrested. The subsequent trials and executions were swift, and the political shockwave was enormous. Anti-Catholic sentiment, already deep-rooted in English culture after decades of plots and the Armada, hardened into something closer to a permanent national reflex. New penal laws against Catholics followed. The bonfire celebrations that burn across England every November still carry the echo of 1605. Beneath these dramatic events, quieter tensions were reshaping the Church's internal life. A theological dispute was opening between those who followed the strict Calvinist doctrine of predestination and a newer movement called Arminianism, which emphasized human free will and a more ceremonial style of worship. Under James, these tensions remained largely manageable, a debate conducted between scholars and bishops. But the lines being drawn in the 16-teens and early 1620s would sharpen considerably in the reign that followed. James I died in 1625, leaving a church that had received its greatest literary monument and a kingdom whose religious fault lines were growing harder to paper over. His son Charles would inherit both legacies. Charles I inherited his father's throne in 1625, and with it every unresolved tension James had managed to suppress. Where James had been shrewd and adaptable, Charles was rigid and remote. He believed in the divine right of kings with an almost mystical conviction, viewing any challenge to royal authority not merely as political opposition, but as something approaching sacrilege. It was a disposition that would prove catastrophic. His marriage that same year deepened Protestant anxieties immediately. His new queen, Henrietta Maria of France, was openly devoutly Catholic. She brought her own priests to the English court, maintained a Catholic chapel, and made no secret of her faith. To Puritan observers already suspicious of ceremonial drift within the Church of England, the Queen's presence at the King's side felt like a warning of where things were heading. The man Charles chose to reshape that church was William Laud, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Laud was an Arminian, a man who believed that beauty, order, and ceremony were not Catholic contaminations but proper expressions of reverence. He moved communion tables back to the east end of churches, railed off as altars. He insisted on bowing at the name of Jesus. He enforced conformity through the church courts with a zeal that struck his opponents as something closer to persecution than pastoral care. Puritan preachers were silenced, suspended, or worse. 3 prominent critics in 1637 had their ears cut off in public. The message was unmistakable. But it was Scotland that handed Laud the crisis he could not survive. In 1637, the Archbishop and the King attempted to impose a new prayer book on the Scottish Church, a church that had never accepted episcopal governance with any enthusiasm. The reaction in Edinburgh was immediate and furious. When the book was first read aloud in St. Giles Cathedral, the congregation reportedly erupted in protest. A woman named Janet Geddes, according to legend, hurled her stool at the dean. Whether the story is entirely true hardly matters. The fury behind it was real. Scotland signed the National Covenant in 1638, a document pledging to defend Presbyterian worship against royal interference. When Charles attempted to enforce his will by force, the result was the Bishops' Wars, 2 humiliating military campaigns in 1639 and 1640 that left the king defeated and financially broken. To raise money, Charles was compelled to recall Parliament, an institution he had ruled without for 11 years. The Parliament that assembled in 1640 had no intention of simply granting funds and going home. It had grievances stretching back decades. It moved quickly and decisively, abolishing the courts Laud had used as instruments of repression, dismantling the mechanisms of royal autocracy, and in 1641, impeaching the Archbishop himself. Laud was sent to the Tower of London, his reforms in ruins around him. By 1642, the language of compromise had largely exhausted itself. King and Parliament were exchanging demands neither side could accept. The Church of England sat at the center of this collapse. Its contested identity as Catholic in form or Protestant in spirit, as royal institution or servant of the people, the very question neither swords nor sermons had yet resolved. When Charles raised his standard at Nottingham in August of 1642, the Civil War had officially begun. The church that Henry VIII had founded as an instrument of royal power was now, in a bitter irony, one of the primary reasons that royal power was being taken up in arms against. What followed would shake every assumption about who controlled England's religious life, and what kind of church might survive the wreckage. The war that erupted in 1642 was not simply a constitutional dispute dressed in military uniform. It was a religious conflict to its core. On one side stood the royalists, the Cavaliers, fighting for the king, the bishops, and the Church of England as it existed. On the other, the parliamentarians, the Roundheads, many of them Puritans who believed that Laud's church had never finished the Reformation that God had demanded. These were not men who fought reluctantly. Many believed the fate of their souls depended on the outcome. Almost immediately, Parliament moved to reshape the religious landscape it hoped to govern. In 1643, it convened the Westminster Assembly, a gathering of over 100 clergymen and 30 parliamentary laymen charged with determining what the Church of England should become. The answer many of them favored was Presbyterianism, the model already established in Scotland, where congregations were governed by elders rather than bishops. To secure Scottish military assistance, Parliament signed the Solemn League and Covenant, promising to bring the English Church into closer alignment with its northern neighbor. It was a promise made under pressure, and one that would prove very difficult to keep. The Assembly produced the Westminster Confession, a rigorous Calvinist statement of faith, along with a directory for public worship designed to replace the Book of Common Prayer entirely. The old rhythms of Anglican devotion, the set prayers, the liturgical calendar, the familiar words of Cranmer's prose were swept aside, Using the prayer book became a criminal offense. Bishops were formally abolished in 1646. The Church of England, the institution Henry VIII had constructed around royal supremacy and episcopal governance, had effectively ceased to exist. Archbishop Laud did not live to see the final dismantling of his life's work. He had remained imprisoned in the Tower since 1641, aging and increasingly frail. Parliament, unwilling to wait for a legal conviction it struggled to obtain, passed a bill of attainder against him, bypassing the courts entirely. On January 10, 1645, William Laud was beheaded on Tower Hill. He was 71 years old. Whatever his cruelties had been, he died with composure, insisting he had always served both his king and his God faithfully. Few among the crowd that watched were inclined to believe him. Charles himself fought on, was captured, escaped, negotiated, and finally surrendered to Parliament in 1646. What followed was years of fractious argument about what to do with a king who refused to genuinely concede anything. By 1648, a second civil war had briefly flared and been suppressed. The army, now the real power in England, had lost patience entirely. The trial of Charles I opened in January 1649. He refused to recognize the court's legitimacy, standing silent or speaking over the proceedings with quiet, stubborn dignity. On January 30th, he walked to a scaffold erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, directly beneath the ceiling Rubens had painted to glorify his father's reign. He wore 2 shirts against the January cold, so that no one might see him shiver and mistake it for fear. Then the axe fell. The execution of an anointed king sent tremors across every court in Europe. In England, it left a nation stunned, divided, and without a framework for what came next. The Church of England had been abolished. The monarchy had been abolished. Into that extraordinary vacuum stepped a soldier named Oliver Cromwell, and with him came a religious experiment unlike anything England had ever attempted. What kind of nation and what kind of faith would rise from the ruins of the old order? What followed the execution of a king was something England had never attempted before: a republic. And within that republic, a religious landscape of extraordinary, bewildering variety. Oliver Cromwell was a man of genuine, fervent faith, a Puritan who believed God's hand guided every battle he had ever won. Yet his approach to religion confounded enemies and allies alike. He extended a remarkable degree of toleration to Protestant sects of almost every stripe. Baptists, Congregationalists, and Independents could worship with relative freedom. Jews, expelled from England since 1290, were permitted to return. It was, by the standards of the age, an astonishing liberalism. But that toleration had sharp edges. Catholics remained subject to severe legal penalties. And Anglicans, the adherents of the supposedly abolished Church of England, found themselves equally unwelcome. For them, Cromwell's Commonwealth was no promised land. Into this chaotic freedom flooded some of the most radical religious movements England had ever produced. The Quakers, founded by George Fox in the 1640s, rejected priests, sacraments, and set worship entirely, insisting that the divine light lived within every human soul. The Ranters went further still, some claiming that sin itself was an illusion for those who had found God. The fifth monarchists read the Book of Daniel and concluded that Cromwell was preparing the way for the literal reign of Christ on earth. The Diggers, led by Gerard Winstanley, began communally farming common land in Surrey, arguing that true Christian freedom demanded the abolition of property itself. England had become a vast, simmering experiment in what religion might become when the old structures collapsed. Meanwhile, the Church of England did not simply vanish because Parliament said it had. It survived in hiding. Ejected clergy gathered small congregations in private homes. Families passed handwritten copies of the forbidden Book of Common Prayer from household to household. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals were conducted quietly, in the old words, away from the eyes of authorities. The prayer book tradition, the cadences Cranmer had forged a century before, proved too deeply embedded in English life to be legislated out of existence. Survival, not triumph, was the task of these years, and the Church performed it stubbornly. Cromwell died on September 3, 1658, the anniversary of his greatest military victories. His son Richard inherited the protectorate, but not his father's authority. Within months, the army had forced Richard's resignation, and England descended into a paralysis of competing factions, generals, and parliaments, none of which could hold power for long. Into that chaos rode General George Monk from Scotland, commanding the one army that remained disciplined and unified. He marched south, and as he did, England began to exhale. After 11 years without a king, without bishops, without the church it had known since Henry's reign, the nation found itself glancing, almost involuntarily, toward the young man living in exile on the continent. The restoration of something familiar was suddenly, urgently possible. On the 29th of May, 1660, Charles II rode into London through streets lined with cheering crowds. Flowers were thrown before his horse. Church bells rang across the city. After 11 years of Republican experiment, England had its king back. And with the king came the bishops. And with the bishops came the church. The restoration of episcopacy was swift and deliberate. The Puritan experiment in church governance was swept aside almost overnight. Bishops reclaimed their cathedrals, their palaces, and their authority. The Church of England, which had survived the interregnum as a quiet underground tradition, now reasserted itself as the undisputed center of English religious life. But reassertion, it turned out, meant punishment for those who had displaced it. The instrument of that punishment was a series of parliamentary acts, so severe that historians would later group them under a single name. The Clarendon Code, named for Charles's chief minister Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon. Between 1661 and 1665, Parliament passed 4 acts designed to crush nonconformist dissent and restore Anglican supremacy. The Corporation Act barred anyone who refused to take Anglican Communion from holding municipal office. The Act of Uniformity demanded total compliance with the restored church. The Conventicle Act forbade unauthorized religious meetings of more than 5 people. The 5 Mile Act prevented ejected ministers from coming within 5 miles of any town where they had previously preached. The sharpest blow came in 1662. A revised Book of Common Prayer was introduced, its language refined, its ceremonies more explicitly Anglican than ever. Every minister in England was required to give their unfeigned consent and assent to everything contained in it. The deadline was August the 24th, 1662, a date that would become notorious in the history of English religion. Approximately 2,000 ministers refused. They could not in conscience accept everything the new prayer book demanded, and so they walked away from their livings, their incomes, and their homes on a single day. History remembers it as the Great Ejection. These men, mostly Presbyterian and independent in sympathy, did not disappear. They became the founding generation of English nonconformity, conducting illegal worship in barns and private homes, just as Anglicans had done under Cromwell. The wheel had turned. Charles himself had little appetite for persecution. He had spent years in Catholic France and harbored genuine sympathies for toleration. His Declaration of Indulgence in 1672 attempted to suspend the penal laws against both nonconformists and Catholics. Parliament was furious. Within a year, they forced him to withdraw it, and they pressed further still. The Test Acts of 1673 and 1678 required anyone holding public office to receive Anglican Communion, denounce the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, and take a formal oath. The acts struck at Catholics with particular force, driving even Charles's brother James, the Duke of York, from his post as Lord High Admiral when he refused to comply. The irony was exquisite. A church that had once faced extinction was now using the power of the state to enforce conformity with a ferocity that mirrored the very persecution it had endured. The wounds of the interregnum had not healed. They had hardened into law. When Charles II died in February 1685, he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, the faith he had quietly sympathized with for decades. He left a Church of England that was legally supreme, institutionally restored, and deeply anxious. For the man now ascending to the throne was his brother James, a declared and unapologetic Catholic, and the question of what that meant for the established church would shake England to its foundations. James II made no secret of his faith. Unlike his brother, who had kept his Catholic sympathies carefully veiled, James wore his convictions openly, attended Mass publicly, and moved quickly to dismantle the Test Acts that had defined Anglican supremacy for over a decade. The Church of England, restored so triumphantly in 1660, now found itself facing a king who considered a heresy. His most provocative weapon was the Declaration of Indulgence, issued in 1687 and reissued in 1688. Invoking royal prerogative, James suspended the penal laws against both Catholics and nonconformists, ordering the declaration read aloud from every pulpit in England. The instruction landed like a thunderclap. Was the Church of England now to become an instrument for Catholic rehabilitation? 7 bishops, led by Archbishop William Sancroft of Canterbury, refused. They submitted a petition to the king arguing that he had no legal authority to suspend acts of Parliament. James was furious. He had the 7 arrested and charged with seditious libel. In June of 1688, they were tried before a packed courtroom, with all of England watching. When the jury returned its verdict of not guilty, crowds erupted in celebration. Soldiers in the streets reportedly wept with relief. That same night, a group of Protestant nobles sent an invitation across the Channel to William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder and husband of James's own Protestant daughter Mary. What came next moved with startling speed. William landed in England in November 1688 with an army of nearly 15,000 men. James's support collapsed around him. His commanders defected. His other daughter Anne withdrew her loyalty. In January 1689, James fled to France. The throne was vacant, or so Parliament conveniently decided. William and Mary were crowned joint monarchs in April 1689, accepting a Bill of Rights that made parliamentary authority permanent and, crucially, barred any Catholic from ever wearing the English crown. The constitutional settlement was decisive. The Church of England was safe. But the Revolution demanded one further reckoning. The Toleration Act of 1689 did not establish religious equality. It was narrower than that. Protestant nonconformists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Congregationalists, and others who accepted the basic doctrines of the Trinity could now worship legally in licensed meeting houses. The machinery of persecution was not dismantled so much as set aside. Catholics and Unitarians received no such relief. Yet the principle had shifted. Conscience, within limits, now had legal breathing room. And within the Church itself, a painful division opened. Approximately 400 clergy, including Archbishop Sancroft himself, could not in conscience swear allegiance to monarchs they regarded as illegitimate usurpers. These non-jurors, as they became known, were deprived of their livings and quietly separated from the institution they had served. The Church of England had survived, but the world it now inhabited was genuinely different, and the century ahead would test what that survival actually meant. The century that followed the Glorious Revolution might have been a moment of renewal for the Church of England. Instead, it became something closer to a long, comfortable nap. By the early 1700s, the theological battles that had consumed the previous century were losing their heat. England was exhausted by conflict, and a new intellectual mood was settling across educated society. Reason, order, and moderation were the fashionable virtues. The Church absorbed this spirit eagerly, perhaps too eagerly. A movement known as latitudinarianism had been growing quietly since the 1660s, and now it shaped the pulpit from the inside. Its proponents argued that Christianity was essentially reasonable, that its truths were accessible to any educated mind, and that doctrinal controversy was largely unnecessary. Sermons became polished lectures on moral improvement. The burning conviction of Cranmer's era or the anguished conscience of the non-jurors was quietly replaced by something cooler and more composed. The problem was not theology alone. The Church of England in this period was deeply, structurally entangled with the landed aristocracy and the Whig political establishment that dominated Parliament. Bishops were political appointments as much as spiritual ones. A well-connected clergyman with the right family name could expect steady advancement regardless of his pastoral gifts. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself sat in the House of Lords, and the boundary between ecclesiastical authority and aristocratic patronage was nearly invisible. This produced consequences that were difficult to ignore. Pluralism, the practice of a single clergyman holding multiple parish livings simultaneously, was rampant. A well-placed rector might collect income from 3 or 4 parishes while residing comfortably in none of them. In his place, a poorly paid curate would conduct the bare minimum of services. Absenteeism was so common it had ceased to scandalize. It was simply the system. And who suffered for it? The answer is obvious when you look at where the Church was failing most visibly. England's population was shifting. New industrial towns were beginning to emerge in the North and the Midlands. Mining communities, agricultural laborers, the growing ranks of the urban poor. These were people who lived far from the gracious rectories and well-maintained parish churches of the South. They were not represented in Parliament. They were not connected to aristocratic networks. And increasingly, they were not being served by the Church of England at all. A yawning spiritual hunger was developing in precisely the places where the established church was least present. It would not remain unanswered forever. The seeds of something disruptive were already being planted in the unlikely setting of Oxford University, where a small, disciplined group of young men had begun meeting with unusual intensity of purpose. What that small gathering would eventually become would shake the Church of England more profoundly than any political revolution had managed to do, and force it to confront the question it had been quietly avoiding for decades: who was the Church actually for? The answer arrived on the evening of May the 24th, 1738. John Wesley, 34 years old, reluctant and spiritually restless, attended a small religious meeting on Aldersgate Street in London. Someone was reading aloud from Martin Luther's preface to the Book of Romans. And something changed. Wesley later wrote that he felt his heart strangely warmed, a phrase so simple it barely sounds like the description of a revolution. But a revolution is precisely what followed. Wesley had returned from a frustrating missionary journey to Georgia deeply uncertain about his own faith. The Oxford Holy Club that had once seemed so promising had not answered the deeper question burning inside him. That evening on Aldersgate Street, something did. He emerged convinced that salvation was immediate, personal, and available to anyone who sought it. This was not the cool, rational Christianity of the latitudinarian pulpit. This was fire. George Whitefield had already begun spreading that fire in ways that horrified respectable Anglican opinion. Where Wesley had his warming heart, Whitefield had his voice, widely described as the most powerful in England. Turned away from church after church, he made a decision that seemed scandalous to every instinct of the established order. He would preach outdoors. In 1739, he stood in a field near Bristol and addressed a crowd of coal miners, men blackened with soot, who had never been welcome in any polished parish church. Thousands came. Many wept. It was, by any measure, extraordinary. Wesley at first found the idea of open-air preaching deeply uncomfortable. He was an Anglican clergyman, trained in the ordered traditions of the church. But he came to Bristol. He watched the crowds, and he yielded to what he called the call of necessity. If the people would not come to the church would go to them. For the next 50 years, he traveled an estimated 250,000 miles across Britain and Ireland, preaching to miners, farmers, factory workers, and servants, to anyone who would listen. The Methodist societies Wesley organized were not intended as a separate church. They were meant to operate within the Church of England, small groups meeting for Bible study, mutual accountability, and spiritual discipline, feeding their members back into regular Anglican worship. Wesley insisted repeatedly that he had no desire to break away. He died in 1791, still technically a Church of England clergyman. But the break came regardless. When Wesley ordained ministers himself in 1784 to serve Methodist congregations in America, something crossed that could not be uncrossed. The Church of England had refused to provide ordained clergy for the colonies, and Wesley acted out of what he considered pastoral necessity. The established church considered it an act of defection. Methodism did not formally separate until after Wesley's death, but the direction had been set long before. What did the revival leave behind within Anglicanism itself? More than is often acknowledged. The evangelical wing of the Church of England, energized by the same revival currents, would not disappear with Wesley. Clergy like William Wilberforce's mentor John Newton and the gathering of reformers at Clapham would carry that evangelical urgency into the very next century, using it to drive the campaign against the slave trade. The Methodist revival had held a mirror up to the established church and forced it to see what it had become. The question Wesley and Whitefield posed, not in pamphlets or parliament but in open fields and borrowed rooms, was whether the Church of England was truly a church for all of England. That question, uncomfortable and unresolved, would drive the reforms and crises of the century that was just beginning to dawn. The Church of England entered the 1830s under siege from two directions at once. Liberal reformers in Parliament threatened to reshape church structures without any regard for their sacred character. And within the church itself, many feared that decades of latitudinarian cool had hollowed out its spiritual core. Into this anxious moment stepped a group of Oxford academics who believed they had found the answer, not in further reform, but in recovery. On July the 14th, 1833, a fellow of Oriel College named John Keble climbed into the pulpit of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford and delivered what he called the Assize Sermon. His subject was what he termed national apostasy, by which he meant Parliament's presumption in suppressing Irish bishoprics without any authority from the church itself. The sermon was incendiary in tone, if not in volume. Keble argued that the Church of England possessed an ancient apostolic identity that no government had the right to alter. The state, he insisted, had forgotten its place. That sermon struck John Henry Newman like a thunderclap. Newman, a fellow of Oriel and the vicar of the University Church, became the movement's restless intellectual engine. Together with Keble, Edward Pusey, and others, he launched a series of pamphlets beginning in September of 1833 called Tracts for the Times. 90 tracts appeared over the next 7 years. Their central argument was bold and deliberately provocative. The Church of England was not simply a Protestant institution created by Tudor monarchs. It was the heir to the ancient Catholic Church, possessing genuine apostolic succession, valid sacraments, and a theological tradition that stretched back through the fathers of the Church to the apostles themselves. The Tractarians, as they came to be called, did not want Rome. They wanted a third way, Catholic in heritage but independent in governance. For a while, it seemed possible. Then came Tract 90. Published in 1841, Newman's final contribution to the series argued that the 39 articles, the foundational doctrinal statements of the Church of England, were not incompatible with Roman Catholic teaching. The reaction was volcanic. Bishops condemned it. Oxford's authorities silenced Newman. Even his allies winced. The tract had pushed the argument to a place where the question could no longer be avoided. How Catholic could the Church of England actually be before it became something the Church of England was not? Newman spent the next 4 years in agonizing withdrawal at Littlemore, a small village outside Oxford. He prayed, he studied, he wrote. On October the 9th, 1845, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church by Father Dominic Barberi, an Italian Passionist priest who had traveled through the night in the rain to reach him. No conversion in the history of the English Church was more dramatic, more painful, or more consequential. 24 other Tractarians followed him to Rome in the same period. The movement had produced its most spectacular crisis. But it had not failed. Those who remained within the Church of England carried the Tractarian vision forward, and its visible legacy transformed Anglican worship across the following decades. Clergy began wearing vestments long abandoned since the Reformation. Candles appeared on altars. Incense drifted through stone naves, and the Eucharist recovered a centrality it had not held in most Anglican parishes since the 16th century. The Anglo-Catholic tradition, born in those Oxford studies and sermon halls, became a permanent and vivid strand within Anglicanism, one that endures in parishes around the world to this day. The movement had asked a question the Church of England could not quite answer cleanly, and that unresolved tension between Protestant identity and Catholic inheritance would continue to shape its character as the Victorian age reached its height. While the Oxford movement turned Anglican eyes inward, searching the Church's ancient roots, another force was carrying that same Church to the far corners of the earth. British ships, British soldiers, and British missionaries were together building an empire on which, famously, the sun never set. And wherever the flag traveled, the cross followed. The process had begun modestly. The first colonial bishopric outside the British Isles was established at Nova Scotia in 1787, a practical response to the waves of loyalist settlers who had fled the American Revolution. Quebec followed in 1793. These early appointments were administrative necessities as much as spiritual ones, men sent to tend existing congregations rather than convert new ones. But the missionary impulse ran deeper, and it had its own institutions. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, founded back in 1701, had long supported overseas clergy. In 1899, a newer and more energetic body, the Church Missionary Society, brought evangelical passion to the project, sending men and women into territories where Christianity had never been preached. West Africa, East Africa, India, China, the Pacific Islands all became fields of labor. By the middle of the 19th century, the maps on missionary society offices in London were bristling with pins. The results were extraordinary in scale and deeply complicated in character. Anglican missionaries built schools and hospitals alongside churches. They translated scripture into dozens of languages, preserving some indigenous tongues in written form for the first time. Samuel Ajayi Crowther, a freed Yoruba slave, was consecrated Bishop of Western Equatorial Africa in 1864, the first African Anglican bishop. His story represented the movement's highest aspirations. Yet the Church's relationship with empire was never innocent. Missionaries sometimes marched alongside colonizers, their message entangled with cultural assumptions that demeaned the peoples they sought to serve. Indigenous traditions were frequently condemned rather than understood. The line between conversion and subjugation was too often blurred. As Anglican churches multiplied across the globe, a question pressed itself forward. How would this vast, dispersed family of churches hold together? The answer came in 1867, when Archbishop Charles Longley of Canterbury invited bishops from across the Anglican world to Lambeth Palace in London. 67 bishops attended that first Lambeth Conference. They gathered not to legislate but to consult, a communion-sharing fellowship in faith rather than a hierarchy issuing commands. The model has endured. Lambeth conferences have met roughly every 10 years since, remaining the closest thing Anglicanism possesses to a worldwide council. By 1900, the Church of England had become something its Tudor founders could never have imagined. It was no longer simply an English institution. It was a global communion, with autonomous provinces stretching from Canada to Australia, from Uganda to New Zealand, each shaped by local culture and history. That diversity would prove to be both Anglicanism's greatest strength and its most persistent challenge. Back home in England, the Victorian Church faced a different kind of reckoning. While its missionaries carried the faith to distant continents, the institution itself was being remade from within and challenged from without in ways that would permanently alter its character. The reforms came first, driven by Parliament and an increasingly impatient public. The Ecclesiastical Commission, established in 1836, set about rationalizing a church that had grown grotesquely uneven in its wealth and duties. Some bishops commanded incomes rivaling industrial magnates. Some parishes held hundreds of souls without a resident clergyman to tend them. The Tithe Commutation Act of 1836 converted ancient payments in grain and livestock into straightforward money rents, dragging a medieval system into the modern age. Parish boundaries were redrawn. Clerical discipline was tightened. A church that had coasted for decades on custom and privilege was being told firmly to put its house in order. Yet no parliamentary committee could have prepared the church for what arrived in 1859. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species did not merely disturb a few clergymen. It detonated at the foundation of a worldview. The following year at Oxford, the tension ignited publicly. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce of Oxford faced the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley in a celebrated exchange at the British Association meeting in June 1860. Wilberforce, reportedly asking whether Huxley claimed descent from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side, found himself outmaneuvered and mocked. The church, in that moment, appeared to many observers as the defender of comfortable ignorance against advancing knowledge. That same year brought another shock. A collection of theological essays titled Essays and Reviews, published in 1860, gathered 7 Anglican clergymen and scholars who dared to apply the same critical methods used on ancient texts to the Bible itself. The outcry was immediate and fierce. 2 of the contributors were prosecuted for heresy, though ultimately acquitted on appeal. The controversy exposed a church in genuine intellectual crisis, uncertain how to hold together faith and scholarship in an age of science. The response, slowly, was the growth of what became known as the Broad Church movement. Figures like Benjamin Jowett and Frederick Denison Maurice argued that Christianity was large enough to accommodate honest doubt, that faith need not require the suppression of reason. Liberal theology, uncomfortable as it made the conservative faithful, began to find a legitimate place within Anglican walls. And through all of this, the Victorian Church kept working. It built schools for the poor, supported temperance movements, staffed charitable societies in the slums of London and Manchester. Whatever its internal quarrels, the church remained embedded in the fabric of English life, ministering to births and deaths, educating children, feeding the hungry. A faith navigating the collision between ancient revelation and modern science, between inherited certainty and honest question, was learning, painfully, to live with complexity. That lesson would only deepen in the century ahead. The century that opened with such confidence closed its first decade with an unimaginable catastrophe. When war came in August 1914, the Church of England responded as institutions do, with certainty and purpose. Bishops blessed departing troops. Clergy preached from pulpits about duty, sacrifice, and holy cause. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, supported the war effort, though with more caution than many of his clergy. What none of them foresaw was what the trenches would do, not merely to bodies, but to belief. Some 3,500 army chaplains served on the Western Front. They buried the dead in waterlogged mud. They sat with dying boys who asked questions no theology had prepared them to answer. Why this? Why here? Why any of it? The chaplains who earned respect were not those who preached, but those who stayed, who carried stretchers, who simply remained present in the horror. Yet thousands of survivors returned home having lost whatever faith they carried into the war. The church that had sent them blessing returned to find them strangers. The 1920s brought a different kind of battle, this one fought in the halls of Parliament. The church had labored for years to revise its prayer book, producing an updated version in 1928 that attempted modest liturgical reform. Parliament, which retained final authority over church matters under the establishment arrangement, rejected it twice. Evangelical Protestants feared it conceded too much to Catholic practice. The episode stung deeply, exposing how far the church remained a captive of political forces, unable to govern its own worship. Then came the second catastrophe. The Blitz of 1940 brought German bombers over English cities, and the church stood in the rubble alongside everyone else. Coventry Cathedral burned on the 14th of November, 1940, its medieval shell reduced to open walls and ash. The image became, in time, a symbol not of defeat, but of resolute endurance. Clergy conducted services in bombed-out shells, bringing communion to shelters packed with frightened families. Through these dark years, one figure rose above the institutional struggles. William Temple, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1942, brought a vision of Christianity as a force for social transformation. His book, Christianity and Social Order, published that same year, sold over 139,000 copies, and argued that the church had not only the right but the obligation to speak on housing, wages, and economic justice. Temple died only 2 years into his tenure in 1944, but the welfare state that emerged after the war bore the fingerprints of his thinking. Yet even Temple's energy could not reverse a tide already turning. Church attendance, which had begun drifting before the wars, continued to fall in the post-war years. The returning generation, having survived the unthinkable, was building new lives that did not always include Sunday mornings. The question now was whether the Church of England could find a new voice for a new age. The post-war decades had already unsettled the Church of England, but nothing prepared it for the battles that lay ahead. These would not come from outside, not from Parliament or foreign enemies or the tremors of war. They would come from within, from the question of who, precisely, could stand at the altar and speak in God's name. The campaign for women's ordination had quiet beginnings. By the mid-1970s, a small but determined movement was pressing the church to reconsider its ancient exclusion of women from the priesthood. In 1975, the General Synod agreed, in principle, that there were no fundamental theological objections to women serving as priests. It was a cautious, carefully worded statement, and it satisfied almost no one. For campaigners, it promised everything while delivering nothing. For traditionalists, it opened a door that could never be safely closed again. The argument stretched across nearly 2 decades. Congregations divided not just along lines of theology, but of temperament, generation, and identity. Conservative evangelicals insisted Scripture clearly reserved church leadership for men. Anglo-Catholics feared that ordaining women would sever the church's connection to apostolic tradition and destroy any hope of reunion with Rome. Letters filled church newspapers. Friendships fractured. The debate, conducted in synod committees and parish halls and episcopal studies, carried an intensity that surprised even those who lived through it. Then came the moment. On the 11th of November 1992, the General Synod voted to ordain women as priests. The measure passed all three houses, clergy, laity, and bishops, clearing the required 2/3 majority in each. Those who had waited 20 years embraced in the corridors. Others wept with grief rather than joy. The fallout was immediate. Hundreds of clergy and thousands of lay members left for Rome or for the newly formed traditional Anglican Communion. The Church of England, attempting to hold its fractured community together, created something remarkable and deeply awkward: the Act of Synod of 1993, which allowed parishes to request a bishop who had never ordained women and never been ordained by a bishop who had. These were called flying bishops, a term that captured both the ingenuity and the absurdity of the arrangement. It was institutional compromise at its most elaborate. On the 12th of March 1994, 32 women were ordained as priests at Bristol Cathedral. After centuries, the Church of England had changed in a way that could not be undone. Within a year, over 1,000 women had been ordained. They took up parish duties, conducted funerals and marriages, administered communion, and built ministries that their predecessors had been legally barred from imagining. But the question of the episcopate remained. A priest could be ordained, but a bishop held authority of a different order entirely. 2 more decades of argument followed. The same coalitions reformed, the same objections were raised, the same anxieties about tradition and unity and scriptural authority returned to the floor of the synod. Finally, on the 14th of July 2014, the General Synod voted to allow women to be consecrated as bishops. The margin was decisive. 5 months later, on the 26th of January 2015, Libby Lane was consecrated as Bishop of Stockport, becoming the first woman bishop in the Church of England's history. As she knelt in York Minster, the hands of bishops were laid upon her head in a ceremony stretching back through the centuries. One bishop in attendance called out an objection. The congregation responded by singing a hymn. What did this moment mean? For supporters, it was a correction long overdue, the removal of a barrier that had distorted the Church's witness for centuries. For opponents, it marked a departure from received tradition that placed Anglican orders in permanent doubt. Both sides claimed faithfulness to the same Church, the same scriptures, the same inheritance. The ordination of women did not resolve the Church of England's tensions. It revealed them with particular clarity. And those tensions between tradition and transformation, between unity and conscience, would carry the institution forward into its most uncertain chapter yet. What does a 500-year-old institution do when the world stops listening? In the early years of the 21st century, that question pressed harder against the Church of England than any theological dispute in its history. Weekly attendance, which had already been falling for decades, dropped below 1 million by 2015. In a nation of 56 million people, that figure told a stark story. Cathedrals filled for Christmas and Easter, tourists wandered ancient naves with audio guides, but the ordinary Sunday congregation, the bedrock of parish life, was aging, shrinking, and in some rural communities, disappearing entirely. Secularization had arrived not as a dramatic rupture but as a slow tide. Each generation left in slightly larger numbers than the one before it. The Church responded with fresh expressions of worship, informal services, cafe churches, online ministries. Some found audiences. Many did not. The question was no longer whether decline was happening, but whether anything could reverse it. Meanwhile, a deeper fracture was widening across the global Anglican Communion. The fault line was sexuality. When the American Episcopal Church consecrated Gene Robinson, an openly gay man, as Bishop of New Hampshire in 2003, provinces across Africa, Asia, and South America erupted in protest. For many global South churches representing the majority of practicing Anglicans worldwide, this was a boundary the Communion could not cross. The Archbishop of Canterbury found himself presiding over a family that could no longer agree on the most basic questions of human life and Christian ethics. The Lambeth Conference of 2008 was attended by fewer than half the world's Anglican bishops. Those who stayed away sent their own message. By the time the Communion gathered again in 2022, the fracture had hardened into something approaching a formal split. The Church of England, caught between its liberal wing and its global partners, satisfied neither side fully. At home, the debate over blessing same-sex unions consumed years of deliberation. In February 2023, the House of Bishops approved prayers of blessing for same-sex couples, stopping short of full marriage but crossing a threshold that scandalized traditionalists and disappointed reformers in equal measure. And then there is the question of establishment itself. Should the Church of England remain the official state church, with bishops sitting in the House of Lords, the monarch serving as its supreme governor, and its ministers conducting coronations and state funerals? Critics argue the arrangement is an anachronism in a plural, multi-faith society. Defenders insist that establishment binds the church to public service, to every parish in the land, to a responsibility that transcends its own membership. The cathedrals still rise above English cities. 14,000 parishes still anchor English communities. Over 4,000 Church of England schools still educate a quarter of England's children. Whether the institution that survived Henry's ambition, Elizabeth's pragmatism, and Cromwell's revolution can navigate this quieter, more uncertain crisis remains the open question of its next 500 years. From a king's broken marriage to a global communion spanning 5 centuries, the Church of England's story is far from over. Subscribe for more epic histories that shaped our world.